It was a really fun time, and this was the original Croce's restaurant. In the winter of 1971, I was selling my paintings and pottery, and Jim was playing songs, but mostly driving a truck, struggling to get by. I found out we were going to have a baby. When I told Jim, he got so serious. He sat down at the kitchen table and realized this was now or never, and he wrote Time in a Bottle. That same week, he wrote You Don't Mess Around with Jim, and about half the songs for his first ABC album. When Adrian James came into the world, Jim was at my side. We had a beautiful, healthy baby boy, and I was so happy to have a family of our own. My husband stayed with me, but then, as we knew, he'd have to leave and go back on the road. It was just part of what you do when you're a professional musician. So while I took care of our son in the middle of the country, in the middle of nowhere, I became a road widow. I waited and waited for 2 years for Jim to come home. The road was brutal on Jim and me, and by the summer of 1971, Jim's music was finally topping the charts with Bad Bad Leroy Brown, Operator, and I'll Have to Say I Love You in a Song. I was pregnant again, and things were really looking up. Jim got an offer to do the Johnny Carson show for a summer replacement, and also to do the movie with Cheech Marin of Cheech and Chong. To be close to Jim's work, we decided we'd move to California. But just as I was ready to have the baby, I started to have complications, and I lost our son Max in childbirth. While Jim was in Europe completing his tour, I was on my own, and I felt so alone. The next month, Adrian James and I moved our family to San Diego. The first weekend Jim had off, he surprised me. He walked in the door, his arms filled with gifts, and promised me that the rock and roll era was over. He had one more week of concerts, and he was coming home. That night, Jim and I made a date to celebrate. We went down to our new downtown and decided to walk through the Gaslamp to see what was down there for great food or live music. As surprising as it may sound, back then, there wasn't a single restaurant or live music venue. We stopped at the corner of 5th and F at the Keating Building and joked that night about opening a restaurant and calling it Croce's. But on September 20th, 1973, that week, Jim's plane crashed in Natchitoches, Louisiana, and that dream was gone. I was a single mom and a widow at 26 years old. I'd already lost my mother and father, my grandparents, and my son Max. And when Jim died, I honestly didn't have any idea what I was going to do. Financially, we were living on $100 a week, and though a lot of people thought that fame had brought us fortune, it hadn't. And I had to figure out what I could do, how I could raise a son, a 2-year-old son, by myself. Well, when you have a child, you get up and you do what you have to do. So I'd get up and make breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And I was truly sleepwalking through that day, through that week, until one day, Jim's first royalty check came. It was for a whole lot of money. And at first, it made me really sad because I realized that Jim had never gotten to enjoy all of his work. But then, when I started to ask the producers and the friends that Jim had who were in charge of our estate, where'd all the money gone? And I didn't get any answers. I got really mad, and I asked for an audit. I want you to know that that was the question of the century. It took me 10 years of insane litigation, fighting 3 cases in 3 courts in 3 states to win back my Croce rights. And in the end, I changed precedent for other artists who had contracts in perpetuity, but I didn't win the case. During those lawsuits, horrible, horrible things happened to me, more horrible than I could have ever imagined. When AJ was 4, he went blind. He developed a brain tumor syndrome, and I just couldn't bear the thought of losing him. This was the hardest time in my life. If it were not for AJ's amazing bravery, I really don't know how I would have made it through. But his spirit encouraged me, and while he was growing up, I would pray every night that he would get his sight back. When AJ was 4, I started the children's school in Point Loma. I wanted him to be independent in spite of his blindness. 2 years later, miraculously, AJ started to get sight in his left eye. He also started the piano and realized he had a gift for it. deciding that he would be in the profession too. In between litigation, I brought a Head Start program to San Jose. I became vice consul for Costa Rica. I wrote a children's book, and I was on the board of the San Diego Women's Bank. But I really missed my music and art. By 1984, with litigation finally over, I'd completed 2 albums, one with the Rod Stewart Group and one with Nick Venet, who'd produced Bobby Darin, Linda Ronstadt, and the Beach Boys. My East Coast tour was just about to begin when I developed a serious vocal cord problem, and after 2 operations, I could never sing again. My voice and all my self-confidence were gone. I just couldn't figure out what I could be passionate about, so I invited my friend Joanne to the house to help me write a resume. After we couldn't figure out what I could do, I offered her my cheese blintzes, the one that my grandmother had taught me to make. I loved making things with my hands, and she said to me, "Well, Ingrid, this is exactly what you should do." And I looked at her and said, ironically, "Open a restaurant?" The next day, I had my business license, and I got a phone call from another friend who told me there was an open storefront in the gas lamp. Little did I know that every storefront in the gas lamp was open. Serendipitously, I recognized that corner that I was on to be the very same corner where Jim and I had stood the night we had been together 12 years earlier. I remembered how we'd searched downtown for a place to eat and to listen to live music, and I rented the space of the Keating building because I really believed it was an omen. Once I negotiated my long-term lease at the Keating, Horton Plaza invited me to join them too. And in 1985 pre-Starbucks territory with only 313 square feet, I was able to make enough profit at Horton Plaza to pay for my losses at Croce's. I thought that was a good business plan. And pay myself a salary. In 1985, pre-Starbucks territory, I was able to do that. But back then, people thought I was crazy. They thought, why in the world would you go to the gas lamp and build a restaurant? Some people even thought I was brave, but I truly was following my dream blindly. I was going right from the heart, and I knew that my dream would one day come true. One thing I have learned is that whether you plan it or all out, or you just make it up as you go along like I did, you can never do it alone. You really need others. And I had incredible support. When I put tables in my kitchen next to the stove so I could take care of cooking and take care of the people, my guests at the same time, the health department came and they told me exactly how to do my business. And then the INS and the IRS and the building department and the fire prevention department, I learned from the best. Working side by side with my employees, over the years, we've built a wonderful community at Croce's. But when I finally wrote my first P&L, I realized there was absolutely no way I could ever do Croce's Restaurant and Jazz Bar without having a bar. And that's not even including the cost of live musicians. So I decided I better join the CRA and Convis and learn how to do what I should have learned to do before I ever got there. Tenaciously, I waited a year and a half to get a liquor license, and when I went to the ABC, they laughed at me. Finally, we got our license. Our dinner menus were on the table, and AJ was performing with the best live musicians in San Diego. I'll never forget that night, because when the night was over, our house burned to the ground. Shortly after that, my favorite employee was taken away in handcuffs. And that's when I thought, I don't know if this jig is really working. But right then, just when I thought the dance was over, my luck turned around. And that winter, I hired an attorney to help me with my favorite employee to get him out of jail. I met him for the first time at Croce's. He and his law partner had come into the restaurant. One of them was wearing a cowboy hat and boots and this smart-ass grin. And I went over to thank both of them. I wanted to say that I was really appreciative of what they had done for me. But this guy with a cowboy hat, he said to me, "You know, you're pretty forward inviting me to dinner, and you don't even know what my name is." And I said, I figured, this guy must think I'm trying to pick him up, which I was not. I was not. And I said, a little embarrassed, "Well, what's your name, partner?" And he looked at me very straightforward, and he said, My name's Jimmy Rock. At 40 years old, I'd met a lot of Mr. Wrongs. And after all my lawsuits, I swore I never wanted to meet another attorney or a musician ever again. Jimmy Rock was both. But on our first date in January 1988, we both knew we'd found our match. Jim Rock was my salvation. When we married in Thanksgiving almost 22 glorious years ago, my new name Rock gave me confidence to be Ingrid Croce. Once I found love again, well, I had even more reason to be optimistic about Croces in the gas lamp. My partner Jim Rock and I began to build our dream together. Jim helped me to write my autobiographical cookbook, Time in a Bottle. And we expanded Croce's to Croce's Top Hat Bar and Grill, Ingrid's Cantina, Art Gallery, and upstairs at Croce's for catering. Finally, when Petco Park was being built, a whole lot more restaurants came downtown, and I believed it was the perfect time to bring a major dining event to San Diego. I co-founded San Diego Restaurant Week, our city's most popular dining event, and I wrote a book, San Diego Restaurant Cookbook, to help promote the event. Then, as a gift literally from the universe, federal copyright law changed, and the publishing that I fought so hard for finally came back to AJ and me. Today when I look back, I can see the lifestyles of my grandmothers had a wonderful impact on me. My grandma Ida passed along her tradition of stunning chicken soup. My grandmother Mary, the entrepreneur, showed me how hard you had to work and how tenacious you needed to be to have a successful business. Though I didn't know it back then, along with my father and mother, they were all my role models, and they gave me the confidence to be Ingrid. When I married Jim Croce, my passion for family and community came true, but I couldn't keep time in a bottle. So when Jim was gone, I had to reinvent Ingrid Croce. Eventually, I found a way to do business, build community, play music, and eat all at the same time, right at Croce's Restaurant and Jazz Bar. Then, when I met Jim Rock on Table 21 and became Ingrid Croce Rock, I found that the help and encouragement I always needed to sustain it was right there with me. When my husband Jim Rock asked me to marry him, I asked Jim to leave his law practice. I asked him to work with me at Croce's and to write the biography of Jim Croce. I asked him to raise our son, AJ Croce. He said he was looking forward to it. But then I asked him again, really seriously, "But doesn't my name bother you?" Jim looked pensively at me and he said, "No, I like the name Ingrid." In closing, I'd like to thank all of you for listening. And I feel so fortunate that Deborah Rosen called me to include me with such accomplished women. Thank you all so much for being here. I think that it's pretty interesting that I got to this podium today just by dancing my Irish jig.